This is a brief video guide to getting started with the Libre 2 and how to set up the alarms. The FreeStyle Libre 2 is similar in a lot of ways to the original Libre with three key differences. Firstly, improved glucose accuracy, but also the options of low glucose and high glucose alarms. The Libre 2 system will be rolled out on prescription for all current Libre users in NHS Lothian between January and March 2021. Time and range is a concept which is gaining a lot of traction in the clinic and is an alternative in some ways to HbA1c. If you have a time and range that is between 3.9 and 10 of greater than 70% of the time, then it's highly likely your HbA1c will be on target. Indeed, if it's greater than 60% of the time, it's very likely to be below 58 millimoles per mole, which is the current Scottish target. And the other key target here is less than 5% of time in hypoglycemia. It's important to point out that target range is not the same as the alarm settings that we'd recommend, but is really a guide to try and help optimize your glucose management. So moving on to the Libre 2 now, the alarms are turned off by default, so you do have to turn them on. The reader or your phone must be within 6 meters of the sensor for the alarms to function, and you will see the system will display a symbol here with the red line through it if the sensor is not communicating with the reader. There will also be a signal loss alarm which will sound if there's not any communication between the sensor and the reader for 20 minutes. And we'd recommend that you make sure that you set your sound and vibration on the reader and the phone. So this slide shows how to set things up if you're using the reader. It's important that you order a new Libre 2 reader from Abbott. Details of how to do this are on our website. And once you get into the menus, if you click the little settings cog at the top right hand corner, it will take you into this menu here. You can then click on alarms and then onto change alarm settings, and then you can click on to the low glucose alarm and change the threshold and turn it on. You can click onto the high glucose alarm and change the threshold and turn it on, and you can also turn on the signal loss alarm, which is important as it lets you know when you're not receiving any signal from the sensor. And then when you've done all of that, you can click OK, and you get a summary of which alarms are on and what the thresholds are. You can also, by clicking on the cog at the top right hand corner, go to the sound and vibration menu and just make sure that you have the system sounds, the vibration and the volume all turned on. And just to point out, as I will do across this presentation, that we would recommend starting with a default low glucose alarm of 4.5 and not the default of 3.9 that the Libre 2 will direct you towards when you set it up. This is really just to show the same process if you're using your mobile phone with the LibreLink app, and it's important just to make sure that you have the most up-to-date version of LibreLink downloaded on your phone. You'll then be able to go into the section here, Alarms, and then to low glucose alarm, click on that. You have the opportunity to then turn it on. Once you turn the alarm on, it will automatically turn on the signal loss alarm. And then you can again select the threshold for the low glucose level and also select what sort of alarm tone you want to sound if it drops down below that. And similarly, same situation as with the reader, we would recommend a threshold of 4.5 for most people to begin with and not the 3.9 that the system will default to otherwise. You can then change your alarm tone and then move on to set the high glucose alert if you want to. A couple of key points here. When the alarm sounds, it will not tell you exactly what the glucose level is. You still have to scan the Libre to find out what the glucose result is, and in certain situations, particularly if it's a low glucose alert, you may want to do a finger prick test to confirm. So I've mentioned that we suggest 4.5 as a starting point, and the aim of the alarm is to help avoid hypoglycemia rather than necessarily pick it up when it's happening. So setting it slightly higher than the hypo threshold gives you the opportunity to pick it up before this happens. The optimal setting will vary for individuals and will depend on how early you develop hypo symptoms, how quickly hypos typically develop for you, and also what your typical glucose profile looks like. So it can be set anywhere between 3.3 and 5.6. But one question perhaps to ask is, at what level would you like to be woken from sleep when you've set the low alarm? And to give an example here, this is someone who's running very tight glucose levels near the lower end of the reference range. And if this person has good awareness, then 4.5 may result in too many alarms because the hypoglycemia may not actually be developing in that case. It may just be a steady 4.5 or 4.4, which is effectively normal. So in someone like this, you could conceivably turn the alarm setting down to 4 and still remain safe. And pregnancy is also another special situation where people are often looking to run very tight glucose control, and we'd recommend anyone who's pregnant discussing specifically with their antenatal team what they would recommend the settings to be in that situation. In somebody who has reduced awareness of hypoglycemia or is prone to very sudden onset hypoglycemia, or indeed severe hypos where you need the help of other people, you may want to have your glucose alarm set at a higher level to really give you the maximum opportunity to prevent hypos before they develop. And again, if you're unsure about this, please discuss it with your diabetes team. So the low glucose alarms will pick up glucose before it drops into the hypoglycemic range, and in that case will often require less carbohydrate to prevent a hypo than you would require to treat a hypo, and this is something that you'll pick up through experience. It's important to look at what you're doing, and if you are overcorrecting to help avoid hypos, to just try and adjust what you're taking in terms of carbohydrate content to limit the overcorrection as well. And if you're finding that your hypo alarms are sounding at the same time each day, consider why that is. Is your basal insulin dose too high? Has it been related to exercise or alcohol intake? And you may wish to speak to your diabetes team or have a look over some of the resources that I mentioned later on in this slide presentation, just to help try and reduce the frequency of hypoglycemia and the number of alarms that are sounding. If you're having lots of overnight hypos, it's useful to work with your diabetes team to try and work out why that's happening. And you really want to be in a position where you're avoiding them to avert what we call alarm fatigue, that is, getting tired with the alarm sounding so often that you're tempted to turn it off. And we'd always recommend people don't turn the alarms off, but if they're becoming irritated by them, it may be that they need to change the threshold at which they're being set off. So moving on to the high glucose alarms, we are recommending for most people to perhaps start with the low glucose and only turn on the high glucose alarm once you're comfortable with using the low glucose alarm. And one of the main reasons for that, again, is this concept of alarm fatigue, that we don't want people to get put off from using the alarms by them sounding too frequently. So it's worth considering what level you would want to set your high glucose alert at, and the table on the right here is a very rough guide as to where you might want to start just based on what your HbA1c is. So those people who have a HbA1c on target might want to set the high alert at 15, whereas people with quite high HbA1c or very low time in range to begin with might want to start with a very high alert level and just gradually bring that down over time. And the same is true of the high as with the low alert, that it's better to adjust the level than to turn it off altogether. And it's also worth considering, what's the level at which you would act? Is there a glucose level at which you would almost always want to act to help bring it down? Because that might help inform where you set the high glucose alert. And also, what level of glucose would you want to wake you from sleep? So how high would it have to be that you want an alarm to be able to wake you and consider a correction dose? So these are two different people with two very different types of Libre trace. On the left-hand side, very low average glucose levels and lots of time in range. On the right-hand side, person B, high average glucose with a lot of time above the target range. And if we set the high alarm at 15, the person on the left would have no alarms at all, whereas the person on the right would be having very frequent alarms, which runs the risk of becoming annoying and causing you to want to turn them off. So it's maybe best to start, if you're the person with the high glucose levels, with a higher threshold that is not alarming constantly, but is alarming at least often enough to give you the opportunity to do something about it. Whereas if you're the person running very tight glucose control, you might end up wanting to turn the high alert to a lower glucose level so that you can intervene even when the glucose is maybe not all that high. Another potential problem with the high alarms is that if you've not quite got your timing of bolus or quick acting insulin right, then after each meal you may find that the glucose peaks and sets off the alarms. And it's important to point out here that this would be a situation where we would not recommend taking extra doses of insulin, because there's a very, very high risk here of stacking the insulin, that is, doubling up the dose and eventually causing hypoglycemia later on. So if you see patterns like this, that the glucose rises very sharply after meals, peaks up and then drops back down again, what you should consider is bringing the timing of your bolus dose of quick-acting insulin earlier in relation to your meal, and that should help reduce the peak and reduce the risk of alarms going off. There are opportunities with the alarm to help with correction doses at appropriate times though, and this is an example here of where that might be the case. So this person has had a meal at around midday, they've taken bolus insulin, but their glucose is steadily rising, and then 3 hours after the meal the alarm has sounded, and what you'll see here is that the little blue triangle is showing what happens with insulin action. You get a very sharp peak of insulin effect after you take a bolus dose within about an hour or so, but then that gradually tails off. So by the time you're 3 hours out from a meal, there's very little insulin acting anymore. And if you find that your glucose level is high and the arrows suggest it's not falling, then it would be appropriate in these situations most of the time to consider a correction dose. Now, you might want to take a more conservative correction dose than you normally would with meals, just to gain some experience of this, and then begin to adjust how you correct in these situations over time based on what's happened previously. If you're finding that the same thing's happening all the time, then you might want to work out why. Is it an issue with basal insulin? Is it the wrong insulin dose with meals? Is carbohydrate counting maybe not as accurate as it could be? So there are a number of areas where you might want to intervene. And so the main benefits of the alarm in this sort of situation are that ability to help correct down when the glucose has gone high, and also to think about what we can do to prevent future highs from happening, particularly where there's a very clear pattern. And you may want to direct yourself to the 10 Steps to Improving Type 1 Diabetes Control guide, which you can download from our website, and a number of other educational resources which, if you haven't had the opportunity to look at, are likely to be of some benefit, particularly the DTN UK FreeStyle Libre education programme, which is a series of videos covering a range of topics which most people with type 1 diabetes would find very useful. And as I've mentioned, we have a few brief guides that can be downloaded from our website, and the address is on the slide here. But most importantly of all, if in using the Libre 2 you run into problems, please contact your diabetes team, whether it's with advice about where to set the thresholds or really what to do to try and help prevent hypoglycemia or high glucose levels. Your diabetes team would be very keen to hear from you.